Hello, everyone. This is Victoria Mattingly, and I am thrilled to welcome you to the SIOP Conversation Series, where we talk with leading industrial organizational psychologists. This is episode 35, and we'll be talking about the science for a more inclusive workplace. Today, our guests will bring fresh perspectives on how leaders can build inclusive organizations from the top down. Welcome to the SIOP Conversation Series, Gena Cox.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to be here, Victoria. I get a chance to watch episodes of this show, and it's really fun and very, very informative. So I'm honored to be a guest.
We're honored to have you. A little bit background about Dr. Cox. She's spent most of her 25 plus year career helping leaders enhance their impact and guiding executives as they build psychologically healthy workplaces. She has decades of experience in executive coaching, measuring and improving employee experience, and diagnosing and enhancing organizational culture. Gena is the author of the recently published book, Leading Inclusion, a guidebook to help leaders build inclusive organizations from the top down. Gena's training as an organizational psychologist is the foundation of her impact as an executive coach. She uses communication, group dynamics, power and influence insights, and other lessons from psychological science to help her clients achieve their coaching goals. Gena is the co-chair of the SIOP Awards Committee and member of the planning committee for SIOP's 2022 Leading Edge Consortium. She earned her Ph.D. in IO psychology from the University of South Florida. And Gena, we are so glad to have you with us today.
Yeah, looking forward to this conversation.
Wonderful. And so to get our conversation started, we would love to hear about your journey as an IO psychologist. So how did you get involved in the field, and what spurred your interest, particularly in inclusive leadership?
I never knew IO psychology existed until I was studying in an undergraduate general psychology program. And I had this professor. Her name was Dr. Galen Perot. She's deceased, but she had earned her PhD in social psychology at the University of Michigan and had spent a lot of time at their Institute for Social Research, which is world renowned. And so she started talking to me about things like measurement and outcomes. I was like, what is this woman talking about? And so it was she who spurred my interest in really thinking about measuring, psychological characteristics in social environments. In this case, I got focused on thinking about the workplace. And it was also she who showed me all of these options within psychology that then prompted me to look for a program. And so I went to do my master's degree in IO at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, well before they had a PhD. And I loved it so much that I then went off and I worked in corporate America for a while. And then I said, I really need to do this PhD. And when I looked around for the PhD program, I found Dr. Wally Borman, who was at the time the president of SIOP. I knew who he was. And I discovered that he had just was joining the University of South Florida. I was like, that's it. I'm going to USF. And the rest is history. I was actually his first PhD graduate at University of South Florida.
I love that. Isn't it funny? I always say it's not the program, it's the advisor that really makes a grad experience. And for you, it was your whole career because of having that connection. And I share that. I studied under Kurt Krager, and I wanted to work with the Kurt Krager at Colorado State. And like the rest is history, as you say. And so it's just so fascinating how much an advisor really impacts your overall career and experience as an IO psychologist.
Yes. And, I had been divorced and I had a 1-year-old daughter, and I remember her crawling around under the legs of his table. How all of that sort of propelled me forward and how it relates to, doing work with inclusion and that sort of thing is really interesting, because what I experienced at University of South Florida was that I had this great experience where I felt like this was a home. I never had any sort of complaints about my experience at the university from a perspective of inclusion and so on. But as I stepped out into the corporate world, it became pretty clear. I was an immigrant. I had only come to the country less than 10 years before, in terms of when I finished my PhD and went into the corporate work world. And so I was learning about America. I was learning about American workplaces. And I was beginning to see that even as I was advising leaders about all the things we know in IO and all the clever things that they can do to make these great work environments, that really my experience really highly depended upon who was my immediate manager. And other people's experiences significantly depended upon that. So I became fascinated with the effect of leaders on employee experience. And in fact, I have stayed ever since then. Most of the work that I have done has been in some way related to what is this leader doing and how is this team reacting or not, how what they aren't doing that they should be doing. Um, but more broadly, I don't really, people talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion work and ask me if I'm a DE&I expert, and I say absolutely not. First of all, I'm not sure what that is. Anybody who proclaims to have all the answers about DEI is either a fool or a liar, regardless of what they study, because we all know that in a lot of ways, the science is relatively, it's not new in terms of when the science started, but it is certainly true that the volume of activity, the volume of research in this domain is only just now starting to catch up with the pace that is necessary for us to have the revelations and the insights that business really needs to make a difference. So I'd say that, I don't talk a lot about DEI. What I am interested in is this idea that I think that inclusion is just leadership, right? That is really one of my fundamental
Yes.
perspectives. Because what we're really talking about, again, is what does it feel like to work in this company? What does it feel like to work in this job? And what does it feel like to work with this manager and these colleagues with whom I have to interact every day, face to face or virtually, to get this job done? And do I perceive that there's any variation in the experience that I have as I'm doing that relative to the experiences that other people have who are doing similar things? So that's sort of my perspective on all of this. It's
Yeah.
why I say I'm sort of more, if I'm an expert at anything, it's sort of leadership and employee experience.
Oh my gosh. And what you said about how inclusion is just good leadership. I say the same thing about DEI. I say good DEI is just really good talent management. It's
Mhm.
hiring people well, it's advancing those people well, it's developing those people well, and that's just good talent management in general. Oh, and it happens to also be really good DEI. And I feel the same way about inclusion and inclusive leadership. I would argue, Gena, that you are a DEI expert, but in specific to the inclusive leadership. But I agree with what you're saying. Like this field and the science of workplace inclusion is still so immature compared to other areas of our field. And so I really admire your humility of not claiming the expert title. Also, did you mean to switch your camera? I see like a different angle of you now. Oh, and I can't hear you either. Are you back? Would you mind saying
I'm
something?
back. I'm
Okay,
back. I was
perfect,
trying
perfect.
to fix that microphone problem, but I'm not going to worry about that anymore.
No, you sound great and you look great. I'm just glad we didn't lose you there. I'm glad we didn't lose you there. And also, you and I have such similar. We have lots of similarities in our background. So I too had a very inclusive leader as my advisor in grad school. I also had my child in grad school, and I was the first woman in the program in like decades to have a child. And so there were no policies in place. And my advisor was also chair, and he was a great ally. And after that experience, they got policy in place so that equity piece, and then also the fact we're both authors on inclusion. But I love we've talked about the similarities and dissimilarities of our book, and the focus on the inclusive leadership really is I think so needed in this space. And so I know you chat a little bit about like inclusive leadership in your journey and how you got there, but like, can you talk a little bit about like the book and how it led you to really, digging into this topic and being using that, as you said, leadership and employee experience expertise and applying it to this specific area?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in some ways, what I had said to you previously was that I sort of looked down on my own personal experience in my decades in corporate America, and I could clearly see a few things. One of them, that thing that I could see, is that I know that managers and especially executive leaders did not really always understand the experience of those that they led. Because if you've got a large organization, it's not easy to do. But even with surveys and a variety of other tools, I know that there tends to be this gap between their perceptions of leaders about what experience are employees having versus the perceptions or the experiences that employees will tell you that they're having. So I was already aware of that. And so, unfortunately, in the spring of 2020, Breonna Taylor was killed. And I remember having a very visceral emotional reaction to that, because while it was not such an unusual thing, unfortunately, that had occurred, I remember thinking she could have been my daughter. She didn't look alike, but there was enough of the something about her just had a very deep emotional impact on me. And just as I was processing that, George Floyd was killed. And so I thought, Gena, instead of being a fake, a fraud, and a phony, who for decades have pretended that everything is okay because you're an IO psychologist and you must be objective and so on. Instead of doing that, what about if you took all of what you know from your training, but applied a layer, or maybe two layers that really reveals that your own personal experiences could help inform the way that leaders think about these issues. The other thing, so that's actually what prompted me to write the book. But then the one other thing I'll say before and then I'll stop, is that I also realized that nothing was ever going to change with regard to these issues that some call diversity, equity, and inclusion, unless they were led from the top. So my book is really intended for primarily that executive leader audience and board directors and so on, to have them think about what can they do differently.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And, you were talking about challenges, in 2020, 2021, but like also since then, we have a whole new wave of challenges. The start of 2023 brought on challenges when it comes to the recent wave of layoffs disproportionately impacting DEI roles. And so can you speak a little bit to the importance of inclusive environments and the challenges that leaders and organizations face in building and maintaining them?
Yeah. So first of all, you probably know already from what I've said previously, that I have this bias that says inclusion tops diversity. I mean, it doesn't matter how many people who fall into the various dimensions of difference you hire. If those people are hired into an organization that doesn't have a nice soft carpet of inclusion, then it doesn't matter. They will join, but they will not stay. They certainly won't get promoted and get visibility and all the things that people desire. So regardless of whether you're having layoffs or whatever is happening in a business, you ought to still be focusing on building this inclusive culture. The reason I think that so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals get laid off in a situation like this, even though everybody agrees that they're trying to solve a challenge that is real, is that often those professionals were hired in an organization absent any strategic plan about what exactly it is that they were trying to accomplish. It gets very, very hard sometimes to do this work well if you don't have an organization that clearly says, this is why we're doing it, this is what it's solving for, this is how it relates to our business outcomes, this is why it's important. So you come to a point where people are making decisions about what can stay and what can go. It isn't surprising then that jobs that aren't clearly defined and with reference to the business strategy, and by the way, I think this is the leader's responsibility, not the person in the job, it makes them a little bit more vulnerable at times like these. I studied, coincidentally, for my PhD dissertation, I studied layoff decision making. And one of the things that I learned in that research, apart from the, sort of what are the criteria that leaders use, which was part of what I researched, and I discovered that, in the end, it really came down to dollars ultimately, right? It really came down to, here's the budget for your division, business unit, department. You need to cut this amount, figure out how you're going to do that. That's frankly how those decisions typically get made.
Yeah.
So regardless of what are the intentions or purposes of various jobs in an organization, it's really important, I think, for anybody who is doing work in this domain to be very clear for the next job that you take, to ask, help that organization answer those hard questions from the beginning, so that you'll get political coverage, you'll get financial support to do the things that you need to do, and that when things go awry, not things in your work, but I mean just in general in your organization, everybody understands the value that your work is bringing to the organization.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Just a quick call out to those who are tuning in live. So the nice thing about this format is that you can submit questions live and we might answer them. So please go ahead, type in the comments, and we'd love to see your questions and potentially answer those. And while you are typing those in, another question related to the book, Gena, with your book, Leading Inclusion, can you share some recommendations for those leaders out there who are trying to build more inclusive organizations from the top down?
Yeah, I mean, I've been hinting at it already. You cannot build an inclusive organization unless it starts at the top. So that's the very first thing. It is really important for the C-suite, the board of directors, to really be involved in understanding what is the current state of affairs in your organization with reference to these things that we call diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what is it that you desire, right? And then what is the gap? In other words, you might have a diversity a strategy that's focused on diversity. That's fine, meaning counting more heads of a certain type and getting them into certain jobs. There's nothing wrong with that. But that has to be really clear what it is you're solving for. But as I have said before, I really recommend that you start at the top by trying to focus on building an inclusive culture. And when I say inclusive culture, I think of it not just from the perspective of what are the competencies that leaders must exhibit, because there are very many inclusion models, inclusive leadership models that you can use, and they're all very, very good. None, because they really hit on some key things often that have to do with, the emotional component, the behavior component, the process component. All of those are important. But I think about inclusive leadership from the perspective, because I'm an employee experience person, from the perspective of the employee. Because what often happens if you're leading this thing from the top is you need to think about what are the outcomes that you're going to drive to. And so the outcomes that I think you should drive to are the outcomes that employees would seek. And what are they? Employees want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be valued. I use those three simple ideas as a quick code to remind you that no matter how many, again, if you just hire more people, that's not going to solve anything. If you don't create an environment in which I feel that my day-to-day experience is one in which I feel seen, heard, and valued, all of the other things that you do are really not going to be sustainable, and they're not going to cause me to feel more connected to the company.
That is okay. So something that really gets me so like frustrated with the field of DEI is the lack of consistency in definitions and operationalization of these terms. And so I wanted to put on the screen what you just said, but employees want to be seen, valued, and heard, and that's really what inclusion is all about. That's how we define inclusion too. So we're getting more consensus. I'm just so thrilled because we need more consensus in how we define these terms, because right now I feel like we're just like throwing a net out into the air and trying to create a more inclusive environment when people don't know what those outcomes are. And so I'm just so thrilled that you shared that with us. Please keep those questions coming. We have just a few more minutes left with Dr. Gena Cox. I'm going to ask another question as the listeners tune in. Gena, with your over 25 years of experience helping leaders enhance their impact, can you speak on how you incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion into your coaching practice?
In my coaching practice, it's actually, I've been a coach for a very long time. And what coaching is all about is what is the thing, when I'm working with my client, I say, I'm not a therapist and I'm not a consultant. When I'm in the coaching mode, I'm not telling you what to do. And I'm not saying, do you love your mother? What I am saying is, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? And so sometimes what people are trying to accomplish is in this realm, again, that some people call diversity, equity, and inclusion. And either they're talking about their own personal behavior to be more inclusive as a leader, or more often they're thinking about, well, what do I need to think about from a strategic perspective to lead inclusion for my department, division, business unit, whatever, enterprise, right? So in those kinds of, if those are the kinds of goals that people have, that falls into the realm of my coaching, because then what I do is try to help them figure out, well, yeah, what exactly should your goals be? What are you solving for? And only then, if you can't articulate what you're solving for, I probably can't help you. But only then can we then start to begin to think about, okay, well, how does this, how does this relate to what you want to accomplish for the business overall? What are the things that are, what are the things that you're already doing that are working? And are there some things that you're doing that you need to change or do differently? Or are there some things you need to start? What are your expectations about the resistance that you will get? Where will it come from? What kinds of resistance will it be? And what can you do to plan for that? What are the unintended consequences of every one of the actions that you might identify that you might potentially want to implement? How do you think in advance about those? And then ultimately, how will you sort of frame all of this so that you can then articulate it to those who will actually be doing the thing, so that it can become, implemented in a scalable, sustainable way where people can say they understand what you're doing and they see the difference. What you can see from what I had just said is that one of the things that beguiles me about any of this work, and has always beguiled me, is why I don't know of any other business issue where business leaders do not apply the same strategic approach to finding this, to identifying the problem, identifying the gap, and then defining the solutions and measuring the outcomes and so on, as they do to every other problem. I really have never understood this. What is so unique about so-called DE&I work is that because it has this thing to do with race and gender and ethnicity, people lose their minds. They lose their rational minds, I mean, in terms of the methods that they utilize or don't to help them solve the problems.
And that's why I love being an IO psychologist in the DEI space, because I feel like it's just so obvious to us. Like, of course, you need to collect data first to properly diagnose the problem. Of course, you need to take a strategic approach and align it to those broader initiatives and efforts. Like, of course, you need to get top-down change management, leadership buy-in, but there's so many people in the field of DEI that don't have our background and our training. And I feel like that's such a huge value add that IO psychology can bring to the field. Speaking of which, a lot of budding IO psychologists are interested in getting involved in DEI work. Hector Rodriguez asked what you would suggest emerging professionals do who want to develop strong DEI capabilities.
Yeah, so first of all, I have you ask yourself what is it that you're trying to accomplish by wanting to do this? And if the reason that you're interested in this work, of course, is you want to make the world better and so on, that's great, because that's sort of my point of view as well. If the reason is that you think that this is just sort of a hot topic, and I'm not suggesting that whoever asked this question, is thinking that. I do know, however, many people who have jumped onto it as a hot topic, and therefore, they think that this is a good idea.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, I think what you need to do is really think about the various kinds of skills that you can develop to help support your potential client in this kind of work. And as I have said before, I don't think the domain is DE&I. I think the domain is leadership. The domain is measurement. The domain is even sort of understanding just generally sort of human dynamics, sort of broadly, right? The domain is culture. So you ought to be thinking about all these various topic areas or content areas and figuring out of those which ones you're strong in, which ones you need to bone up in, which ones you know very well and don't need to focus on. But you do need to there's a whole wide range of things that I think you need to understand, measurement and so on. The other thing, though, I think somebody asked a related question of me yesterday, is how do you get your foot in the door? Well, I don't think I would hire anyone who doesn't have any sort of work experience and say, here, you should be a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional. So getting your foot into the profession, I think, or into that domain should begin with using what you already know and starting wherever you are. Because regardless of whatever the focus is of your degree or the focus is of your job, what you need to figure out is for the organization in which you work, what are their pain points? What are their issues? So start there. And once you figure out what are their pain points and their issues that you might be able to then use your expertise and your training in, then you could actually start making little proposals about things that you might be able to do to help make things better with regard to that pain point. I think that's the best approach because I think this work has so many demands, political demands, emotional demands. A lot of people who start this kind of work leave early because it's just too much emotionally. Because of the rigors of the work, I really think it's to your advantage to be very thoughtful about where you go to do it and how you sort of get yourself ready to excel in it.
I love that. And I feel like there's a theme coming out. So being a good DEI practitioner is just being a really good IO psychologist. The same way as inclusive leadership is just really good leadership, and the same way that DEI is just really good talent management. It's just doing our work is something that using the science that we have, organizational science, we're de-biasing processes. And that's really like the root of where a lot of these DEI issues it's the root of them. And so by applying the methodologies that we already know and that we're already good at to solve these DEI related problems, we're actually just doing good IO work. And I just love that.
That's right.
All right, I'm going to put up one more question. This will be our last question. This is from Jensen Mecca, who asks, what do you think about, when you think about employee experience, what are the outcomes or the measurement approaches that you have found most useful?
Mm-hmm. So because I have been involved in measuring employee experience for a very long time, if you're talking about it within the context of this so-called DE&I work, here's what I have observed over the years that I then try to use to help me guide leaders in terms of what they should focus on and explore. What we've known for decades is that if you measure employee engagement and satisfaction in the workplace, and if you array those scores by a variety of dimensions of difference, but let's just use race because it's the easiest, and in America, it's certainly always a hot button. So if you array in terms of race, what you will discover, for example, generally speaking, of course, is that employees who identify or who are Caucasian will tend to have higher scores on many of the things that we would measure, and that Black women and Black men, Hispanic men and women, and Asian American and Pacific Islanders and so on, sort of array themselves in a pretty consistent pattern, high to low: white, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and Black. That's a generalization, okay? But that generalization has held true for a very long time. And where you really see the variability is on those measures that have to do with whether I, for example, have access to training and opportunities to develop, whether I have visibility, meaning I have ideas. First of all, are they heard? Is there space for those ideas? And then when those ideas are great, do other people attach my name to them so everybody knows that Gena did that? And then does that attachment then work in terms of building currency for Gena? So she then gets the next opportunity to give her greater visibility so that maybe one day she's at the top of, or the head of, or the whatever it is, the most prestigious kind of role. So it has a lot to do with career training access or development access, career mobility, career visibility. And then, of course, there is all the things that have to do with manager effectiveness. What is my experience day to day with the person who is leading me? And what we have learned for decades in our discipline, but very specifically during the pandemic, one of the things that we learned is that the more engaged employees were the employees whose managers were checking in on them. Mm-hmm. And were they checking in on them with some consistency, and not checking in just to ask about work, but also to ask about what do you need in those check-ins, so that I could know my manager has my back. That's an example of another kind of behavior that I really encourage leaders to measure in terms of outcomes that matter to employees. So hopefully that answers a little bit of the question that you've asked. Those are the examples of some dimensions that I pay great attention to when I look to see what the patterns are across different groups.
What a wonderful IO way to end, but talking about measures and outcomes. Gena, I could geek out with you over workplace inclusion and the science of inclusion all day, but unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. And so to our listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning in. Gena, on behalf of SIOP, all of our listeners, thank you for such an engaging and enlightening conversation and for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's been a pleasure, and anyone who didn't get to ask a question, just ping me. I'd love to chat.
Yes, and please keep the conversation going in the comments. So whether you're tuning in on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, keep conversation going. We have these comments, and these conversation series is to keep us connected as a community all year round, not just at the amazing annual conference that just wrapped up. But please join us again for our next conversation on May 2nd at 11:15 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you all soon. Until then, take care.